What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, Nick, we got a lot going on in the world of combat sports. We got some Jake Paul, Nate Diaz news. Sergei Pavlovich is fighting Curtis Blaydes this weekend. But I want to start off with UFC Kansas City because it was a great card. It was a historic night for Max Holloway. And at 31 years old, he's like a young veteran. I mean, he's 7 hours in the octagon total time, 3,000 significant strikes landed. He's winning that race by a country mile. What did you make of his performance?
Well, it's insane to watch him compete. And, our youngest brother said something last night. It's like you're watching a legit veteran, somebody who's been there, done it for so long, and has been in the minds of MMA fans forever. But he still moves like a young guy. Usually when you have somebody who's got the amount of experience and hours in the cage and hours in the training room, they look like, they've seen better days and they don't look like they're in their final form. But Max Holloway is in the age of his prime, and he's truly fighting like he's in his prime right now. I was so blown away with his performance, and everybody knows how good Arnold Allen is. You don't get to 19-1 or now 19-2 as an MMA fighter without being just one of the baddest dudes on the planet. Also undefeated in the UFC, which is like one of the most difficult things in all of sports to do. Like, there's so many different styles in the UFC. There's so many great matchups and so many like stylistic just nightmares for everybody in the UFC, no matter what skill set you bring. And for Arnold Allen to go in there without losing once until he meets Max Holloway was very impressive. And I will say that Arnold Allen looked great, and I think he had a lot of good moments. Clearly showed how good of a striker he is and how much power he has on his shots. I mean, some of those that landed on Max were ridiculous. But Max never gets sat down by anything, and he always finishes the combinations and the exchanges with a little bit more than what his opponent brought in. So there's a lot you can say about Arnold Allen, but the night did belong to Max Holloway, and he did show us why the best is blessed and why there are absolutely levels to this game.
Yeah, and Arnold Allen going 10 fights undefeated in the UFC. I don't know how many people have done that, but I would venture to say that list could be counted on my two hands. Probably very few people. So that's a real achievement, and I think Arnold Allen could definitely be a future champion. He's going to learn a lot from this fight. You celebrate your wins and you learn from your losses, and this is definitely going to be one of those experiences for Arnold Allen. And I think the biggest takeaway for him is that he belongs. I mean, Max Holloway is arguably the best ever, or certainly in the top 3 best ever at 145, and he stood in there for 25 minutes with him and made it a competitive fight. Now, the night did belong to Max, but it was a competitive fight for sure. But breaking down what Max did last night, because it was just a thing of beauty. I mean, Lorisenko said it best. He goes first and third, meaning he starts the combination on his terms. He allows his opponent to counter the way that he believes that they're going to counter because he's very good at reading shots. And then he finishes up the combination. Usually, one person will go, it's like a dance. One person will throw, the other person will throw, and then they'll kind of dance around for a little bit and repeat over and over and over again until the fight ends or until somebody gets finished. But Max is very crafty with how he sneaks 2 and 3 extra shots in after you think the combination is going to be over. And he did that with some really good boxing and some really clean body kicks. I'm surprised Arnold Allen's got a hell of a chin on him, and he can eat some body kicks like nobody's business because Max was throwing hard last night.
Yeah, he's got a great gas tank, and those body kicks will start to shut you down. And when it disrupts your breathing patterns, you can really get thrown off and start to lose all your energy for the round. But Arnold Allen was definitely one of those experienced type of guys that knows how to deal with it, how to put a poker face on and sort of skate away, regather himself, collect his breath and energy, and then go back in. He was competitive throughout the entire fight, but Max Holloway is so used to 5 rounds. He's been the champion for so long, and everything he's done for the past probably 5 years has been 5-round fights. Arnold Allen can't say the same thing, but he did look good. He did look like he could last 25 minutes, but Max Holloway looks like he thrives in 25 minutes. And I think the pacing was a big difference. Arnold Allen came out there guns a-blazing. He was like a storm in the first round, really hard to deal with, throwing big power shots, landing a lot of them, but you could tell, okay, he doesn't really have the energy to maintain this pace for 5 rounds. Max Holloway was kind of being more defensive. He was throwing his shots, but fighting off his back foot and moving backwards, which is very difficult. But somebody who's able to utilize like a defensive style offense to just get their guy tired and skate through the first early parts of the rounds is very, very experienced. And it shows a maturity that Max Holloway has that a lot of people don't. And that's why you started to see him come on real strong by the time, the 3rd round started and then into the championship rounds. And that's something that Arnold Allen just wasn't really familiar with. He did really good. I do think that Arnold Allen belongs in the 5-round club. I think that he could be a champion at some point. But Max Holloway is just like Robert Whittaker is at 185. Nobody's beating him unless your name is the champ, Izzy Adesanya, or in his case, Volkanovski. And it does sort of leave Max in a weird position because he's so much better than everybody else that they're putting him in there with, but he does have 3 losses against the champ, and so it's kind of weird if you see them go for a 4th time. Eventually, he'll probably become undeniable and will get that shot. That is, if Volkanovski can maintain the belt, but I do feel for Max Holloway in that situation. It's like, what else do I got to do? Do I have to, beat everybody all over again? Or, am I going to be this number 1 contender for eternity until Volkanovski leaves or loses? So I do feel for him in that regard. But the MMA world is better when Max Holloway is active, and I don't see him losing if he comes in and performs like he did last night. I was so blown away, and I can't wait to see him go again.
Yeah, and it really, last night's performance, it wasn't Volkanovski's night. He wasn't even in the building, but it does show you that Alexander Volkanovski is that guy. He is, to do what he did to Max, especially in that last fight, because the first 2 were competitive. Arguably, Max could have had one of those 2, but that last fight was as clear as day. Volkanovski got everything off on Max that he wanted, and Max got very little off on him. And then to see Max get in there against a guy who's on a 10-0 run in the UFC and do what he did last night, it really shows how good the champion is. And obviously, we're not going to do MMA math here on this show, but we saw what Max did to Yair, and we saw what Volk did to Max. I do think Volkanovski's probably going to be holding the belt at 145 for as long as he wants to, or until Father Time catches up with him. So it really does beg the question, what happens with Holloway? Because he's a big star, he's a fun fighter, he's right in his prime. And I think last night he looked bigger than he's ever looked. A couple of the times he's fought, the last 2 or 3 times, he's looked a little skinnier than usual. Last night was not the case. He looked very filled out. He looked very muscular. And now he's 31. He's pushing 32 years old. As he gets into that mid-30 area of his career, is he going to try to make a run at 155, fill out the frame a little bit and see what happens there, see what shakes out there? There's the Conor McGregor rematch down the road. Everybody would love to see that. There's some fun matchups at 55. And if Volkanovski's just going to hang onto that belt at 45 for as long as he wants to fight, then maybe that is a nice progression for Max. But the good thing, the thing he's got going in his favor is there's no shortage of fun fights for him, and everybody likes to see Blessed fight. And when he's putting on performances like that, he's always going to be main eventing, and he's always going to be getting bonuses.
Yeah, and to go back to my first point about Max is, he's entering his prime as his age, and I think strength-wise he's going to be stronger than he's ever been. And fight IQ-wise, we saw last night that he's the best he's ever been for sure. He's always been a great fighter. He's always been game, and he's always been skillful. But now, watching the way he was switching stances and just circling off and being inside a range and not really worried about the big shots that were coming from Arnold Allen until he knew they were for sure on the way, shows just how smart he is in there. Like, the creativity and just the knowledge that he has when it comes to the striking realm of MMA is some of the highest level fight IQ that I've ever seen. And last night that was on full display. I think that his mentality and just his mindset for the game is the best it's ever been. And I do think now that he's actually entering his prime age-wise, we're going to see a new form of Max. And I think he's going to be even more disruptive with his striking. He's going to be even crisper. He's going to be even cleaner than he was just a couple of years ago when people were saying, this is the best boxer in the UFC. This is one of the best strikers the UFC has. I truly think that he evolved into a new level last night, and he showed us some things that we haven't seen before. Arnold Allen, likes to get into his rhythm, and he's able to move in because he's so explosive and athletic. He can move in, find some big shots, and usually crack people. And he did catch Max a couple of times, but as soon as Max got the read on him and he was able to understand when Arnold was going to come in, he got very disruptive with his striking. That little chop kick to the front leg was slowing Arnold down tremendously because you can't really just run in there if somebody's kicking just above your knee because that can really cause a lot of problems. Plus, Max has one of the best jabs in all of MMA, and he was able to use that range perfectly. I could go on and on and on about all the good things Max Holloway did, but I do have to say that if we see him go in there again and he comes in making the progress that he's been making over these past few months, we're going to see a guy reach a whole new level. Somebody that's already been a champion and we didn't think could probably get much better, we're going to see him enter a whole new realm. And that's something that you really don't see in somebody who's been in the game for like 10 years and who has like 7 hours worth of MMA time or cage time. It's very impressive.
Well, when you see somebody with 6+, 7+ hours of cage time, you think more Clay the Carpenter Guida, who was also on the card last night. Love Clay, but he's not fighting like Max Holloway's fighting.
Right.
And it took, 1,500 shots absorbed by Max Holloway, and never has he hit the canvas. And so now transitioning into the co-main event, it only took one perfect shot for Edson Barbosa to get Billy Q out of there, and showed us at 37 years old that he's still one of the most electric, explosive, and powerful, and also accurate fighters for that matter when it comes to the striking realm. He is always a threat. I don't care how old he is. I don't care that he was on a 2-fight skid and he's coming back after a year off. He is always dangerous until that final bell rings, and Edson Barbosa can shut the lights out at any given time.
Yeah, and everybody knows that from 135 to 170, all of those weight classes are known as the highest level weight classes that the UFC has ever had, that MMA has ever seen. But 145 was on display last night. You saw just how good Max Holloway is. Obviously, everybody knows Arnold Allen came in there undefeated, looking really good, like a title contender. And then you see all the way up at number 14 is Edson Barbosa. And that just shows you how deep that division is, because Edson Barbosa looked really good in there. His strikes are some of the best. Everybody knows him as being one of the most electric and powerful kickers that we've had in the UFC's history, really. And I was just happy to see him get back to his winning ways. Edson Barbosa came down from 55, and everybody was like, oh, God, we got a new boogeyman, and we want to see him mix it up with the best of the best. And they didn't give him easy fight from the beginning, but he did stumble a couple of times when he first got down into 145. And I was like, oh, man, this is an experiment gone wrong, and I don't think that is deserving. I think Edson Barbosa does have the skills to be a top 5 45er. He just has to get into his winning ways. And if he's able to do to some of the new guys that are at the top 5, top 10 of 145, like he did to Billy Q, we could see another run for Edson Barbosa. And I'd love to see that. He's a vet as well, just like Max Holloway. And to see him go on a little bit of a run might be something worth the fans' time. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, Edson Barbosa's he's must-see TV because the entire fight you're just watching on the edge of your seat, like, is it going to be a switch kick? Is it going to be a knee? Is it going to be a roundhouse kick? Is he going to chop your leg so much that you can't stand anymore and you have to just say uncle and be done with the fight? So he can win in so many different ways. Usually it's with his feet, but he's got some great hands too. And the fact that he was 14 coming in last night just shows you, as you said, how deep the division is. I think he could probably crack in, but maybe not into the top 10, but maybe the 11, 12 spot with that performance. But I think his next fight should definitely be against a guy coming off a win who's also in the top 10. I think if Edson Barbosa is going to make another run, it's going to have to be now. He's 37. It's tough. 145 is tough. And I think it's unlikely that Edson will ever be the champion again, but there's no fight, including Volkanovski, that you could say Edson Barbosa's fighting this person that I wouldn't be like, man, I'm excited to see that.
Yeah, Edson's, you got to tune in when he's fighting, and I think he does have some good fights left. I don't ever see him getting to the UFC's gold, but there's a lot of fun fights. There's meaningful fights, and he could be one of those guys that is a nightmare for the up-and-comers to try to get through, and they'll probably be avoiding him at all costs on their way to the belt. Enough can be said about him, but Billy Q looked all right in there. He looked like he was trying to rise to the occasion, and Edson Barbosa's a big name, maybe the biggest name that Billy Q's ever gone in there with. And sometimes you just have to realize that it's not going to be your night, and you have to shake it off, move on, because Edson Barbosa's been there, done that, and gotten his hand raised against a lot of great competitors in the UFC. Billy Q will probably dust himself off and be able to jump back into the mix and hopefully get himself a ranking soon, but you're not going to steal that 14 off Edson Barbosa very easily.
No, you're not. And he's going to wake up today and say, you know what? I got knocked out by Edson Barbosa, and then look at the list of others that have and be like, you know what? Yeah. I'm in pretty good company.
Exactly.
So moving into a little bit of news now. Obviously, not quite as skillful as what we saw in the main and co-main last night, but Jake Paul is going to be boxing again. He's going to be taking on Nate Diaz. So this kind of answers some questions and then brings some questions up. Jake Paul he signed with the PFL and said, look, I'm going to be making my MMA debut. The PFL is going to do this Champions League. It sort of looked like Francis Ngannou might make his way over there because they were talking about a large pay-per-view split, and maybe there was going to be a Jake Francis card of sorts. But it seems like that's on hold now. It seems like he's going to spend the summer at least focusing on boxing, which would push his MMA debut to the end of the year at the earliest. So what do you make of the Jake Paul-Nate Diaz announcement first? It seems like he tried the boxing realm with a real boxer his size, his age, and was like, you know what? Back to the MMA fighters. Let's make a big payday. Let's make a big event out of it. I'm not mad at the fight, but it's interesting to me to see this be announced.
Yeah, and a loss is never something you want, right? Jake Paul would have loved to have got his hand raised against Tommy Fury, but I think it was a blessing in disguise because, okay, you call out somebody who's technically a real boxer and you don't win. Now you get to jump back a step. You don't have to move into a more difficult opponent than Tommy Fury, and you don't have to go into a more niche, industry, try to find some boxer who's 8-0 that's got some form of clout, and it's just a sticky situation. Yeah, I don't think the numbers for Jake Paul versus Tommy were near as good as some of the numbers he's done with Tyron Woodley, even Ben Askren, and these types of fights. I believe that the bigger the name against Jake Paul, the better the results are going to be for Jake Paul, and also the better the results are going to be as far as the finances come in. Nate Diaz is far bigger a star in the MMA and combat sports world than Tommy Fury is. And I just don't really know if there's enough people that have a big name, a big following, and a similar boxing record to Jake Paul for him to go out there and compete against. And I think that losing that last fight sort of brought everybody's expectations down. Now people aren't like, oh, well, I'd like to see him fight Canelo, or I'd like to see him fight Bivol or Beterbiev. Those are people that just want to see Jake Paul get knocked out. They just they want to see him lose because they don't like him for whatever reason. Maybe he's too rich, too young, too,
flashy, whatever.
Yeah, flamboyant with all of his money and the way he likes to live. The kid has earned the right to do what he's doing right now, and I think that he's proven that there's a market for him to compete at a high level of boxing, at a major promotional side of things, and he's got the right dance partners. These MMA fighters are going to take the bait every single time they offer it to him because there's so much money that comes with fighting Jake Paul. And at the end of the day, they do think they can beat Jake Paul, but the money's worth it, where even if they do lose, it was a good night of business for them. And I think that Nate Diaz is the perfect next opponent. There's been some beef, constantly between them two. Everybody knows that when Nate Diaz sees somebody get a little bit of a rise as far as, hype goes or promotion goes, or maybe they get they start to gain a little thunder, he likes to insert himself, and he knows exactly what to say to poke the bear, to insert himself into the name of fighters or opponents that person could go into, and Jake Paul's no difference. I think Nate Diaz would go in there against Logan Paul if he had the opportunity, and if he wants to, try to drum up some brother versus brother drama, there's something there. I always felt like from the beginning of the Jake Paul experiment that we were going to see Nate and Jake cross paths, and I guess this is the most appropriate time for them to do it. This may be the most difficult boxing match that Jake Paul is going to have to date, minus the Tommy Fury fight. Any of these MMA fighters that are coming over to box him are usually at a discrepancy, and they don't have the boxing skills that Jake Paul has, even though a lot of people think Jake Paul sucks at boxing. He goes out there and proves them wrong. Nate Diaz has some boxing. When you have Andre Ward signing off on you, and you have all the accolades that Nate Diaz has inside and outside of the ring in the octagon as far as boxing goes, you're in for a good night of boxing, and I think Jake Paul and Nate Diaz are going to be able to gain a lot of excitement.
Yeah, I mean, if you sparred rounds with Andre Ward and he says this guy's legit, these guys both, he said they both have hands, meaning Nate and Nick. Obviously Nick's not really doing much anymore, but Nate Diaz, at the end of that Leon Edwards fight, he made things look pretty interesting, and in hindsight now, that seems more impressive than it did back then. Yeah. So I think obviously Jake's a 3-1 favorite, which is kind of what I expected. Nate's in his late 30s, Jake's in his mid 20s, and this is a fight where he's going to be substantially bigger. He's focused only on boxing for the last however many years, and Nate's coming over. He's supposed to be the bad guy that's coming in on the B side and is going to lose the fight. But make no mistake about it, Nate is bringing the crowd with him, and a big reason that this will probably be the best pay-per-view that Jake does to date is going to be Nate Diaz. It looks like they're booking AT&T Stadium, Dallas Cowboys Stadium in Texas. So that's going to be, if they think they can fill that stadium, they're expecting this to be a major event. So it's it was almost inevitable, as you said, that this fight was going to be announced. I didn't think it was going to be next because of all the PFL steam, and it seemed like he was training MMA. There was some footage of him wrestling with Bo Nickel. I was like, oh, this is interesting. He grew up as a wrestler, him and Logan, and his frame, honestly, is more suited to that of an MMA fighter than that of a boxer. And so I was kind of interested to see what PFL carved out for this quote-unquote Champions League and how that pay-per-view structure worked, and if it was something that the rest of the MMA world would take notice on because it was very successful, or the opposite, maybe it was unsuccessful. So we got to kick that can a little bit further down the road. It's going to be a while before we see Jake Paul in a cage of any kind, but sign me up to watch the Nate Diaz versus Paul fight. And as a Nate Diaz fan, it's hard to get excited for this because I feel like I know what's going to happen, but you never know. Diaz can surprise you.
Yeah, Diaz has great boxing, but, him and his brother, they both love to block punches with their head. And Jake Paul, you can say a lot about him, and you can even be negative about his boxing skills or lack thereof. But one thing he's got is power. Yeah. He's got size and he's got power, and he knows kind of when to throw it. Not all the time. His timing isn't perfect as far as his boxing goes, but every now and again he does find that shot. And I wouldn't call it a lucky shot, but his strategy's pretty good. He knows when to throw those big bombs, and he's had some success with them so far. So I'm excited for the fight. Obviously, I'll kind of be hoping that Nate Diaz can get the job done, because it kind of makes everybody that's fought Nate Diaz and wasn't able to get him out in 4-ounce gloves look a little bit lesser of a striker, and it kind of makes the UFC look, sort of funny if Jake Paul goes out there and finishes somebody that nobody's been able to finish in the UFC. But at the same time, I've gone against Jake Paul a few times on these predictions and things like that. And while we're not doing a prediction right now, I'm now going to have to start going towards Jake Paul winning these fights when he's going against an MMA veteran who really doesn't have any business boxing a 6 or 7-0 boxer. So I know I'm probably going to catch a lot of flack for that, but I think that Jake Paul will have the skill advantage, and obviously he's got the youth, he's got the speed, he's got the power. A lot of things are swaying in his favor. Nate Diaz is just a dog. He's an experienced fighter. He's been there, done that, and been hit by the who's who. So I'm excited to see it happen. And I do think that if we get a good outcome from this, we get a good promotional build-up, and we do see a fun night of fights, which a lot of people are going to tune in for, we could very well see Nate versus Jake in MMA, just like Jake was talking about. Let me come in, we'll do a 2-fight deal. I'll box you, and then we'll go over and do MMA after. I could very well see both of these guys' next 2 fights being against each other, just in 2 different sports.
Yeah, it's a good point. Maybe Nate could be the MMA opponent, and that would be very interesting. And that would be much more likely that Nate would win that fight than he will the boxing match.
And PFL would love that. PFL getting their hands on Nate Diaz and Jake Paul. Now that's a pay-per-view you could actually sell. You do pretty good in, and it might be their first or second pay-per-view that they've ever done. To see some success like that in one of your very first goes would be pretty impressive for PFL.
Yeah, and if they did end up putting Francis on that card and he does sign with the PFL, it would be interesting to see who's the main and who's the co-main, because it'd be hard to take that main event spot from Jake Paul and Nate Diaz.
Right, but then you've got the scariest puncher, the heaviest puncher the world's ever seen, and he was the heavyweight champion of the world. And when Francis became a free agent, he lost the most important title that he's ever had and could ever have, period, which is the heavyweight champion of the UFC. That means so much. And Chael Sonnen has said it. I'm not trying to parrot what he's saying, but he did make a great point. When Francis became a free agent, he was no longer the UFC's heavyweight champion of the world. He's Francis Ngannou. Right. And how big of a name is Francis Ngannou? Francis Ngannou is nowhere near as big of a name as the UFC heavyweight world champion. Right. That carries a lot of weight. Francis Ngannou, that doesn't carry near as much weight. So if you go down to the supermarket and you ask the little old lady pushing a cart, what do you know of? Francis Ngannou or the UFC and the heavyweight title? They're going to know 9 times out of 10 what the UFC is and what the heavyweight title means. They're not really going to know who Francis Ngannou is. So I do think that Francis shot himself in the foot a little bit. I have no idea where he's going to wind up. I think his options are limited, and we might see him back in the UFC before everything's said and done, and he won't even have tested the waters in any other promotion. He's just going to go straight back into the UFC, unfortunately not as the champion. But I guess that's all to be determined in a pay-per-view card between Jake and Nate, and then Francis versus whoever they've got in the PFL would be a mega night for MMA fans, and I think the industry would do well and support it.
Yeah, and Francis' biggest problem is the dance partners just don't exist outside of the UFC. Right. And so there's a few people. We just talked about Nate Diaz. He's one of them. Jake Paul's probably another one for different reasons. Conor McGregor, Jorge Masvidal, now retired. Those are your guys that draw crowds and draw attention, regardless of who the dance partner is. Francis was getting to that range, but he wasn't there yet. The John Jones-Francis fight was a mega fight because of the two men involved in the dance. And then if you take Francis out of the UFC, you take away all of the Pavloviches, the Curtis Blaydes, the Derek Lewises, and all of the people that can draw as an opponent against Francis Ngannou. Cyril Gane, former training partner. There's a built-in story there. You know, who's in one championships heavyweight division? I'm an MMA. I'm a hardcore MMA fan. I couldn't name you 5 people that fight in one championships heavyweight division. Yeah. Same goes for Bellator. Same goes for PFL. Some organizations have really deep division. You want to go over to lightweight at PFL? There's some really fun matchups over there. You want to go to 145 in Bellator? Great. AJ McKee's over there waiting for you. There's some good matchups. But heavyweight is light outside of the UFC. And I think that was the one thing Francis didn't really, calculate when he made this move. And when his management team suggested that he make this move. And so then you look towards the boxers. There's the Deontay Wilders. There's the Tyson Furies. But there's Anthony Joshua. Those guys also know that they don't need Francis for a $30 million night of business. Those guys are in a league of their own. Those big 3, and Usyk involved as well, now 4, can all fight each other and all make $20 to $30 million and do what they do. Right. They don't need Francis to get rich. Right. Francis needs them to get rich. And so they can kind of push him out of the boxing boys club. Yeah. And then Francis is just kind of in no man's land, which is where I think he finds himself right now. And I wasn't even expecting to go down the Francis Ngannou road with this conversation, but I think it's worth noting because the Jake Paul news with Nate Diaz does now seem like that fight that was supposed to happen in PFL where you thought they may be on a card together is certainly not happening anytime soon.
Yeah, and we weren't really talking about Francis, but we do have to bring it up when you talk about Jake and Nate, and it's kind of an MMA fighter moving over into the boxing realm and trying to do something. Nate is already a major star, so he can do whatever he wants in any sort of rule set, and it's going to be successful. Francis is a big name in MMA. He's not a big name worldwide. People don't really know who he is. And I think once he became a free agent and he relinquished that belt, all of those big heavyweight boxers with the names behind them, Tyson and the ones you named, all of them were like, well, we don't really care to beat up some guy named Francis Ngannou. We would have loved to have beat up the heavyweight champion of the UFC because that would help us and that would sort of be something we can sell. Our promoters don't really want us to beat up some 0-0 boxer who just so happens to hit really hard. And, what if there's that odd chance that Francis Ngannou lands a big shot? You got an 0-0 guy beating somebody who's the world champion in heavyweight boxing. That looks really bad. So the risk versus the reward is so not worth it for these big boxers anymore now that he's not the heavyweight champ. You always want Dana White on your side when you're doing business and when you're trying to do cross-promotional stuff. It's very rare, but if you are going to ask for it, if you are going to try to make something like that happen, you really need Dana White on your side because what he brings is a great, negotiation side, and he also brings that belt that everybody wants. And everybody in the world knows there's a lot of belts in boxing, there's a lot of belts in MMA, there's kickboxing, you name it, but no belt is as, sought after and looked at and revered as the UFC's gold. And heavyweight is obviously the biggest, most important, meaningful title. And I just feel like Francis Ngannou, without that, is way less of a hot commodity.
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it shakes out because the best move for him, as you said, is to go back to the UFC. But Dana has come out and said, absolutely under no circumstances is Francis Ngannou ever fighting under the UFC's banner again. And it's not just once like he was pissed off and he said it and he's kind of retracted like the Ronda Rousey, women will never be in MMA. And then Ronda Rousey comes along. But it seems like he's got a personal grudge, and he talks about 75 dinners with Hunter Campbell and 2 years of negotiation and time wasted. This seems like some real sour grapes for Dana. It seems like he doesn't like Francis. He doesn't like his management team. Obviously, Francis, we got to respect him for pushing for better fighter pay and healthcare and all of that. But at the end of the day, there was a little bit of self-serving in this whole negotiation. Right. He wanted massive amounts of money. And even the BKFC, Dave Feldman, I believe is his name, came out and said, look, Francis just is unrealistic with his asks. He wants too much money. He can't draw to garner the type of money that he's asking for. So if he'd have stayed in the UFC and he fought John Jones and maybe he beat John Jones, I think it's unlikely, but he could have. I mean, I think we all could say that Francis had a chance in that fight. Then pull out every organization will pull out the checkbook. Every organization will pay you whatever you want. You're the guy that knocked out the greatest fighter of all time. The sky's the limit. But I think what he did was a bit premature. And now it's going to be interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, and unfortunately for him, there's no major stars or celebrities or YouTubers in his weight category that are willing to fight and have become big names in the celebrity / legitimate boxing world like Jake Paul. I can't wait for Jake Paul and Nate Diaz. Who knows if Francis inserts himself onto one of their cards. It'd be cool if he did. We don't need him if he doesn't. But that fight to me sticks out as something that I'm excited for. And I think August will come sooner than later. And we're probably going to be in for quite a treat when Nate Diaz and Jake Paul gets locked into the squared circle.
It's going to be an event for sure. Mm-hmm. And now moving into the heavyweight division again, two guys that are competing under the UFC's banner. One who's been knocked out by Francis Ngannou, Curtis Blaydes, is on a couple of fight win streak. He's looking pretty good. He's trying to get his name reinserted back into title contention. He thinks he's a good matchup for John Jones because of the grappling prowess. He's taken on Sergei Pavlovich. Now, the thing about Curtis Blaydes is he beats everybody who's not a really heavy-handed power puncher. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for him, Sergei Pavlovich is on a 5-fight knockout streak, and that includes one against the Black Beast, Derek Lewis, and Tai Tuivasa. So Pavlovich has proven that he's got some heavy hands, and what he lacks maybe in the grappling department against Blaydes, he's going to make up for with the power. So how do you see this one going?
I think this is a great matchup for the heavyweights. They need it, and John Jones and Stipe just can't seem to get it right. I don't know what the exact situation is, if they have a date, if they've kicked it down the road a little bit longer, if they don't have a date, if they haven't agreed on whatever. But we do eventually need to see John Jones get in there and fight again soon. He didn't have any sort of issues with Cyril Gane. That he got out unscathed, and we would like to see John Jones more active. And I think that Stipe and him are just too busy with all the extra stuff, and we're never going to see them fight. And, now we've got ring rust we got to talk about with Stipe, and John Jones probably still didn't get all the rust off of him after that long layoff because he came in and made such short work of Cyril Gane. So I think this is a number one contenders matchup. I saw Pavlovich in person, and the guy couldn't possibly be bigger. He's one of those guys that likely has to duck down to get between doorways, and I guess Curtis is probably the same, but this guy looks crazy. Like, Sergei Pavlovich is probably one of the scariest humans I've ever seen in person, and he has champion written all over him. I could see him being a nightmare matchup for everybody, including John Jones at heavyweight. And Curtis Blaydes has obviously had some issues with getting his hand raised against some of the best guys at heavyweight, but stylistically, he's a nightmare for a lot of people there. And as long as he can stay away from really big power punchers who can just shut the lights off with one shot, then he usually has a pretty good chance at winning. And not only is his grappling way better than almost everybody in the heavyweight division, but his striking's looking really good these days. So while I can say the same thing about Curtis Blaydes with seeing both of them become champions at some point, I am leaning towards Sergei Pavlovich to get his hand raised in this one. There's just something about this guy. I think what he's bringing in, the confidence and the skills and the streak that he's on, is going to carry him right through Curtis Blaydes. And Curtis is always going to be meaningful in the heavyweight division, but I think this guy Pavlovich is onto something, and we could see him in a title fight very, very soon.
Yeah, I'm picking Pavlovich as well. I think he's got good enough grappling to get back up. I think it's going to be a close fight. I think Curtis will get him down a time or two, and Sergei will have to use some energy and work his way back up. But eventually, those power punches that he likes to throw in combination are going to make themselves known, and it's going to show up on Curtis's face, and he's going to eventually get the finish, because Curtis's Achilles heel, as I said earlier, is the power puncher. Yeah. And Sergei is not only a power puncher, he's a precise puncher, and he throws in combination. Yeah. So that's a very deadly combination for Curtis Blaydes when that happens to be your Achilles heel. And I, like you, think that Pavlovich has champion written all over him. He's a big guy. He's a stoic guy. He's almost like a Fedor a little bit. Even a newer and improved version of Fedor. Obviously, he'll have to get the belt and have some wins before he can make that claim. But he seems to have all the makings, and the fact that he's only 30 years old. We talk about 30 being the prime of your career. as at the lower weight classes. But as you start to get to heavyweight, light heavyweight, 30's just scratching the surface. 32, 35, those are the really good years for heavyweight fighters. And he's just now getting into that realm. And to be as good as he is already, I think he's going to be a nightmare for a lot of people. And as you said, including John Jones. If he were to get in there with John right now, I would pick Jones to win. 2 years from now, I don't know. I don't know what happened. Who knows if John sticks around. Also, John's dedication is something to come into question because he has to want something. The last couple of defenses at light heavyweight were lackluster. Arguably Dominic Reyes beat him in that fight. And even if you think John won, it was a razor close fight. But John showed us just after 3 years how hungry he was again, going in there and making quick work of Cyril Gane. But if they do make the Stipe fight and he gets Stipe out of there, the greatest heavyweight of all time, it's okay, is he dedicated again? Is John like, okay, what more is there for me? And he has a 6 month or a year period where he takes off and he's not dedicated. And then somebody like a Pavolvich is in the gym every day just improving. Well, that could get very interesting. So it's going to be fun to see. Curtis does think he's got stylistically the right matchup for John, and John's not a one-punch knockout kind of guy. John's an accumulative sort of fighter. He does have power, but it's not the Derek Lewis, Francis Ngannou power, and Curtis has got the grappling to match him. So I think the number one contender will come out of this fight, and if the Stipe-John fight just can't happen for whatever reason, they need to put the winner of this fight in there with John Jones next, and sign me up because that'll be a good one.
Absolutely, and they definitely will. And when I saw Pavolvich, he was in there just as a alternate. Yeah, when he was in Vegas. So I think that this is for sure for the number one contenders match, and likely if it ends early and whoever wins goes out unscathed, we could see a quick turnaround. They could say, all right, you guys don't want to do business. Stipe, if it's your fault, then we're just going to take John and we're going to put him in there with the winner of this fight. And we could see, by International Fight Week or, sometime in the late summer, we could see these guys square off. And I'd really love to see it happen. I think John Jones would give a lot of problems for Curtis Blaydes because Curtis is going to be looking to shoot, but everybody forgets because of how good John is everywhere, just how legit he is as a wrestler and a grappler. That would be a very fun matchup for me. And I think Pavolvich has everything you need to become a champion. It's very difficult to beat John Jones, but Pavolvich does seem like he's operating on a different level, and I'd love to see him in a title shot soon because I feel like he'll be able to rise to the occasion and give us definitely an interesting fight.
Most definitely. Well, guys, thanks so much for sticking around and listening to this episode of the Barnhill Brothers Show. If you haven't already, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop us a comment and let us know who you're predicting this weekend. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.